Ladies and gentlemen, there is a profound lesson hidden within the collision of two personalities, the one who consumes emotional energy and the one who naturally gives it. When a person who thrives on admiration, control, and emotional dominance encounters someone whose strength is compassion and empathy, a silent battle begins. Not a battle of voices, but a battle of values. And values always determine outcomes more than volume ever will. Narcissistic behavior is often misunderstood because it wears the mask of confidence while secretly being fueled by insecurity. On the surface, it may appear as boldness, authority, or unshakable self-belief. Yet beneath that exterior lies a fragile sense of identity that depends heavily on the opinion's admiration. True reactance is quiet, stable, and self-sustaining. It does not need constant applause to survive. In contrast, insecurity is loud, demanding, and restless because it is always searching for reassurance. When a person builds their self-worth on external validation rather than internal understanding, they create a foundation made of sand rather than stone. Every compliment becomes a temporary boost, every criticism becomes a deep wound, and every relationship becomes a tool rather than a connection. This is why their emotional world is unstable. It rises and falls based on circumstances instead of principles. The need to appear superior often comes from a hidden fear of being seen as inadequate, instead of confronting personal weaknesses and growing from them. An insecure individual may construct a false image of perfection. They exaggerate achievements, minimize flaws, and seek control over conversations and relationships because control gives the illusion of safety. However, illusions require constant maintenance. The more energy spent maintaining an image, the less energy remains for genuine growth. Over time, this creates exhaustion, frustration, and an endless cycle of comparison. When identity is built on being better than others, rather than better than yesterday, peace becomes impossible. There will always be someone more talented, more successful, or more admired, and each comparison becomes another crack in the fragile self-image. Another critical aspect is the dependence on emotional supply. When self-esteem is internally developed, a person can enjoy praise without depending on it. But when insecurity drives behavior, praise becomes oxygen. Without it, emotional suffocation begins. This is why some individuals constantly seek attention, admiration, or validation from multiple sources. They may surround themselves with people who constantly affirm them or manipulate situations to remain the center of focus. The tragedy is that this pursuit rarely brings satisfaction because external approval can never fully heal internal doubt. It is like trying to fill a leaking container. No matter how much is poured in, it never feels enough. Insecurity also distorts perception. Constructive feedback may be interpreted as an attack, and honest conversations may be viewed as threats. Instead of seeing criticism as an opportunity to improve, it is seen as an attempt to diminish. This defensive mindset prevents learning and blocks personal evolution. Growth requires humility, the willingness to admit imperfection, and the courage to change. When insecurity dominates, humility feels dangerous because admitting a flaw seems like losing value. In reality, acknowledging a weakness is the first step towards strength. But fear disguises this truth and convinces the individual to protect the ego at all costs. Relationships suffer deeply under this pattern. When someone is driven by insecurity, interactions often become transactional rather than authentic. People are valued for what they provide, admiration, loyalty, or status, rather than who they are. This creates shallow connections that lack emotional depth. Genuine intimacy requires vulnerability, honesty, and mutual respect, but insecurity resists vulnerability because it fears exposure. As a result, the individual may push away those who truly care while clinging to those who merely flatter. Over time, loneliness grows even when surrounded by people because real connection cannot exist where authenticity is absent. The most powerful transformation begins with self-awareness. When a person recognizes that their need for validation stems from unaddressed fears, they open the door to healing. Instead of asking, "How do others see me?" the question becomes, "How do I see myself?" This shift moves power from the outside world to the inner self. True confidence develops when individuals accept both their strengths and their limitations without shame. They stop performing for approval and start living with purpose. They listen more, compare less, and learn continuously. In doing so, they replace the exhausting pursuit of admiration with the fulfilling journey of self-development. Ultimately, insecurity disguised as confidence is like wearing armor made of glass. It looks strong but shatters easily. Authentic confidence, however, is like a well-rooted tree. Storms may bend it, but they do not break it because its strength comes from within. The path from insecurity to confidence is not built on louder voices or grander displays. It is built on reflection, honesty, and consistent personal growth. When self-worth becomes self-generated rather than externally borrowed, peace replaces anxiety, relationships become genuine, and success becomes meaningful rather than performative. That is the moment when confidence stops being an act and becomes a natural state of being. Empathetic individuals often carry a unique emotional strength that is frequently misunderstood, even by themselves. Their compassion is not weakness, it is emotional intelligence operating at a high level. They have the rare ability to sense unspoken pain, to read emotional undercurrents, and to offer comfort without being asked. However, this gift can slowly transform into a burden when empathy is not balanced with self-respect. Because they naturally understand others, they tend to justify harmful behavior for far too long. They search for reasons behind cruelty, excuses behind neglect, and explanations behind manipulation. In doing so, they convince themselves that patience is always the right answer, even when patience begins to cost them their peace. An empath does not tolerate pain because they enjoy suffering. They tolerate it because they believe in potential. They see who a person could become rather than who they consistently are. This hopeful vision keeps them emotionally invested long after warning signs appear. They tell themselves that everyone has flaws, that everyone deserves understanding, that love requires endurance. While these beliefs are noble, without boundaries they become dangerous. Endurance without limits turns into silent self-sacrifice. The empath begins to normalize disrespect, believing that forgiveness is the same as strength. Yet true strength is not the absence of limits. It is the wisdom to know where limits must exist. The longer an empath remains in a painful dynamic, the more they internalize responsibility for problems they did not create. They start asking, "What did I do wrong?" instead of asking, "What behavior is unacceptable?" This subtle shift changes everything. Instead of evaluating the situation objectively, they evaluate themselves harshly. Their empathy, which should be a bridge to understanding, becomes a mirror reflecting blame inward. Over time, this erodes confidence and clouds judgment. They continue giving emotional energy, believing that if they just love harder, listen more, or try differently, the situation will transform. But emotional generosity without mutual respect is like pouring water into a container with a hole. No matter how much you give, it will never be enough. Another reason empaths tolerate pain longer than they should is their deep discomfort with conflict. They are natural peacemakers. They would rather absorb tension than create it. Silence feels safer than confrontation, even when silence harms them internally. They fear being misunderstood, labeled as cold, or accused of being unkind. So they choose emotional endurance over emotional expression. Unfortunately, unspoken hurt does not disappear, it accumulates. Each ignored boundary becomes another invisible weight. Eventually, the empath finds themselves exhausted, confused, and emotionally drained, wondering how they reached such a state when all they ever tried to do was love sincerely. Yet within this prolonged tolerance lies an important lesson. Empathy is meant to be shared, not exploited. When an empath learns that compassion must include themselves, a transformation begins. They realize that understanding someone's pain does not require accepting their harmful behavior. They discover that kindness toward others should never demand cruelty toward oneself. This realization is not instant, it is gradual, often born from repeated disappointment. But once it takes root, it becomes a powerful awakening. The empath starts recognizing patterns instead of isolated incidents. They begin to distinguish between temporary mistakes and consistent disrespect. Their emotional awareness, once directed entirely outward, finally turns inward, and that is where true empowerment begins. The moment an empath understands that boundaries are not barriers but guidelines, their tolerance becomes balanced with wisdom. They stop confusing forgiveness with permission. They learn that walking away is not a failure of love, but an act of self-preservation. Their compassion does not disappear, it matures. It becomes selective, intentional, and rooted in self-respect. They no longer measure their worth by how much pain they can endure, but by how well they can protect their peace while still remaining kind. In the end, the empath's journey is not about becoming less caring. It is about becoming wisely caring. Their heart remains open, but not unguarded. Their generosity remains present, but not limitless. They understand that emotional strength is not proven by how long they can stay in hurtful situations, but by how courageously they can choose healing when necessary. What once looked like endless tolerance evolves into conscious compassion, a form of empathy that uplifts others without abandoning oneself. And in that balance, The empath finally experiences the freedom and clarity they were always meant to have. When a deeply compassionate person finally reaches their emotional limit, the shift that occurs is not loud, dramatic, or explosive. It is quiet, steady, and absolute. For a long time, they may have endured misunderstandings, disrespect, emotional manipulation, and repeated disappointments, not because they were weak, but because they believed in healing, growth, and the potential for change. Their endurance was rooted in hope. They often saw the wounded child behind the harmful behavior, the insecurity behind the arrogance, and the fear behind the anger. This ability to see beyond the surface is a gift, but when misused by others, it can slowly transform into a burden. The empath gives chance after chance, believing that patience will inspire transformation. Yet what they often discover is that patience without reciprocity becomes silent self-betrayal. Reaching the emotional edge is not a sudden event, it is a gradual awakening. It is the accumulation of moments where their kindness was ignored, their boundaries were dismissed, and their feelings were minimized. Each incident may seem small in isolation, but together they form a mountain of emotional exhaustion. The empath begins to realize that love should not feel like a battlefield, and understanding should not require self-abandonment. This realization is powerful because it marks the transition from unconscious tolerance to conscious awareness. Awareness changes everything. Once a person clearly sees a pattern, they can no longer unsee it. And when clarity replaces confusion, decisions become firm rather than emotional. What makes this withdrawal so powerful is that it is not fueled by hatred or revenge. It is fueled by self-respect. Anger seeks reaction, but self-respect seeks peace. When an empath decides they have reached their limit, they are not trying to punish anyone, they are choosing to protect themselves. This distinction is crucial. The departure is not an emotional outburst, but a calm conclusion. They stop explaining themselves repeatedly. They stop defending their worth. They stop begging to be understood. Instead, they begin investing their energy inward, rebuilding the parts of themselves that were neglected while trying to maintain a one-sided connection. This inward shift is what makes the withdrawal permanent. It is not a temporary emotional response. It is a structural change in priorities. The permanence of this decision often surprises those who underestimated them. Many assume that because the empath forgave in the past, they will always forgive. But forgiveness and tolerance are not infinite resources when they are continuously exploited. The empath's silence after reaching the edge is not emptiness. It is fullness redirected towards self-growth. They begin to rediscover hobbies they abandoned, friendships they postponed, dreams they delayed, and passions they silenced. Their identity, once entangled in trying to fix someone else, becomes centered again on their own purpose. This transformation is quiet but undeniable. They no longer seek validation from the same places because they have learned that peace is more valuable than approval. Another reason this withdrawal is so impactful is that it removes emotional accessibility. While anger leaves doors open for negotiation, calm detachment closes them gently but firmly. The empath does not need to announce their exit. Their energy speaks louder than words ever could. Conversations become shorter, reactions become minimal, and emotional investment disappears. It is not cruelty, it is clarity. They understand that remaining emotionally available to someone who consistently causes harm is not compassion, it is self-neglect. By stepping back, they are not losing their caring nature, they are refining it. They begin to offer empathy where it is appreciated and protect it where it is exploited. This stage is also a profound educational moment for the empath themselves. They learn that boundaries are not barriers to love, they are safeguards for dignity. They discover that saying no is not an act of rejection, but an act of alignment with their values. Most importantly, they realize that their worth was never dependent on someone else's recognition. This awareness creates emotional independence, which is one of the strongest forms of empowerment a person can achieve. Emotional independence does not mean isolation, it means connection without self-sacrifice. The permanence of their withdrawal stems from growth. Once someone grows beyond a pattern, returning to it feels unnatural. The empath who once tolerated chaos begins to crave calm. The person who once chased understanding begins to choose environments where understanding is mutual. This evolution is not about becoming colder, it is about becoming wiser. Their compassion remains, but it is now guided by discernment. They no longer pour endlessly into empty vessels. They give where there is appreciation, reciprocity, and respect. Ultimately, reaching the emotional edge is not the end of their kindness. It is the beginning of their balance. It is the moment they understand that protecting their peace is not selfish but necessary. The power of their withdrawal lies in the fact that it is not driven by bitterness but by growth. They walk away not to escape pain, but to embrace clarity. And clarity, once achieved, rarely allows a return to confusion. When a person depends on external validation to feel worthy, they unknowingly hand over the steering wheel of their life to everyone around them. Their emotions rise and fall based on applause, attention, and admiration. This creates a fragile identity, one that looks confident on the outside but trembles within. The danger of external validation is that it is never permanent. It is seasonal, conditional, and unpredictable. The moment praise fades or attention shifts elsewhere, the individual feels invisible, anxious, and restless. Instead of building inner confidence through self-reflection, discipline, and purpose, they chase approval like a thirsty traveler chasing mirages in a desert. The more they chase, the more exhausted they become, and the further they drift from their authentic self. True confidence is not built from compliments. It is constructed from character. It grows when a person learns to respect their own standards, even when no one is watching. The individual who relies solely on others to feel important is like a house built on sand, impressive in appearance but unstable in storms. And storms are inevitable in life. When rejection, silence, or criticism arrives, the emotional structure collapses because it was never reinforced from within. Stability begins when a person shifts focus from "how am I seen?" to "who am I becoming?" That shift transforms insecurity into grounded assurance. Because internal validation is renewable, reliable, and resilient, there comes a powerful moment when compassion reaches its limit and patience finds its boundary. The empath is often misunderstood as endlessly tolerant, but empathy is not weakness. It is strength guided by emotional intelligence. However, even strength must be protected. When someone repeatedly gives understanding, forgiveness, and emotional energy without receiving respect or reciprocity, exhaustion sets in. This exhaustion is not loud. It is quiet and cumulative. It builds through small disappointments, unkept promises, dismissive words, and repeated emotional neglect. Eventually, the empath reaches a point where continuing to give feels like self-betrayal. That moment is transformative. It is not an explosion of anger, but a calm realization that self-respect must now take priority over self-sacrifice. The withdrawal that follows is often mistaken for cruelty, yet it is actually clarity. It is the realization that love without boundaries becomes self-destruction. When the empath steps back, they are not abandoning kindness, they are redefining it. They learn that protecting their peace is not selfish but necessary. The power of this turning point lies in its finality. Once emotional clarity is achieved, the empath no longer negotiates their worth or bargains with their dignity. They understand that their value does not decrease because someone failed to recognize it. This awakening marks the end of emotional overextension and the beginning of emotional balance, where compassion is paired with wisdom and generosity is guided by discernment. When manipulation stops working, a hidden crisis begins within the one who relied on it. Manipulation thrives on reaction. It feeds on emotional responses, arguments, confusion, and guilt. Without participation, it loses oxygen. When the other person no longer reacts, argues, or defends themselves, the manipulative cycle collapses. This collapse is deeply unsettling for the individual who depended on control as a form of security. They may attempt louder tactics, stronger words, or intensified emotional pressure, but none of it yields the same results. This is where self-destruction quietly emerges. It does not always appear as dramatic failure. Sometimes it manifests as internal chaos, restlessness, and frustration. The person begins to confront a reality they long avoided, the absence of genuine influence, without the ability to control others. They are forced to face their own insecurities, unresolved fears, and emotional immaturity. This confrontation can either become a doorway to growth or a tunnel into deeper denial. Those who choose denial repeat the same destructive patterns, damaging relationships and isolating themselves further. Those who choose reflection, however, discover an opportunity for transformation. The end of manipulation is actually the beginning of self-awareness, but only if humility replaces pride. Growth requires the courage to admit, I must change, rather than insisting, everyone else must change for me. The greatest victory in emotional conflict is not revenge, dominance, or proving superiority. It is personal evolution. Many people waste years trying to win arguments, expose faults, or seek validation from those unwilling to give it. Yet true power is not found in defeating others, it is found in mastering oneself. Evolution occurs when a person decides that their peace is more valuable than their pride and their growth is more important than their ego. This decision redirects energy from external battles to internal development. Instead of obsessing over who was right or wrong, the focus shifts to who they are becoming. Emotional discipline replaces emotional reaction. Boundaries replace bitterness. Understanding replaces resentment. This transformation is liberating because it removes the need for approval and dissolves the fear of rejection. The individual no longer measures success by how others respond, but by how aligned they are with their values and purpose. Personal evolution is quiet but powerful. It does not seek applause, yet it commands respect. It is the process of becoming emotionally independent, mentally resilient, and spiritually grounded. When someone reaches this stage, they realize that losing unhealthy connections is not a loss but a release. They stop chasing closure from others and start creating clarity within themselves. And in that clarity, they discover the ultimate truth. The strongest position in life is not control over others, but control over one's own mind, emotions, and direction. Many people mistake arrogance for strength, but true understanding reveals that chronic self-centered behavior is often rooted in deep insecurity. A person who constantly needs admiration, attention, or control is not standing on solid inner confidence. They are standing on approval borrowed from others. Borrowed strength is fragile. It depends on constant reinforcement, constant praise, and constant emotional supply. The moment those sources disappear, the illusion begins to crack. This is why individuals who depend heavily on validation often experience inner collapse when they lose the people who once affirmed them. Their identity was never internally built. It was externally maintained. When the external mirrors vanish, they are left staring at an undefined reflection of themselves, unsure of who they truly are or what they truly stand for. On the other side stands the empath, a person whose nature is to understand, forgive, and support. Empaths do not endure pain because they are weak. They endure because they believe in potential. They see what someone could become, not just what they currently are. This gift, however, can also become a burden when compassion turns into over-tolerance. The empath may ignore warning signs, excuse repeated hurtful behavior, and silence their own needs in hopes that love or patience will eventually transform the other person. Yet every heart, no matter how generous, has a limit. Emotional endurance is not infinite. When that boundary is finally reached, the shift is quiet but powerful. The empath does not need revenge, confrontation, or chaos. They simply withdraw their energy. And this withdrawal is not impulsive. It is the result of accumulated understanding that self-respect must eventually outweigh sympathy. When emotional support is removed, the one who relied on it begins to experience instability. The loss is not merely relational, it is psychological. Manipulation loses its target, control loses its leverage, and drama loses its audience. The patterns that once worked suddenly fail, and without self-awareness, the individual begins to spiral. They may seek replacement sources of validation, but replacements rarely provide the same depth of understanding or patience. This creates frustration, resentment, and confusion. Instead of introspection, they often blame others, repeating cycles that lead to isolation. The true self-destruction is not loud or dramatic at first, it is subtle. It appears in broken relationships, damaged reputations, emotional volatility, and an increasing inability to maintain meaningful connections. The absence of reflection becomes the seed of decline. True power, however, belongs to those who cultivate boundaries and emotional discipline. Boundaries are not acts of cruelty, they are acts of clarity. They communicate value, not only to others but to oneself. When a person learns to say no without guilt, to step back without fear, and to choose peace over conflict, they begin to operate from inner authority rather than external pressure. Emotional discipline is the ability to respond rather than react, to analyze rather than explode, and to walk away rather than engage in endless cycles of negativity. This discipline transforms pain into wisdom. It allows individuals to protect their energy while still maintaining compassion. Strength is not found in how much one can endure. Strength is found in knowing when endurance becomes self-betrayal. Growth ultimately depends on the choice between healing and resentment. Resentment feels powerful in the moment, but it quietly chains the heart to the very experiences it wishes to escape. Healing, in contrast, requires humility, reflection, and courage. It demands that individuals confront uncomfortable truths about their patterns, their fears, and their emotional habits. Those who choose healing begin to evolve. They no longer seek to win arguments, they seek to understand themselves. They no longer chase validation, they build self-worth. They no longer depend on controlling others, they focus on mastering their own reactions. This evolution creates emotional independence, a state where peace does not rely on external approval, but flows from internal stability. In the end, the greatest victory is not proving someone wrong or watching another fall. It is rising above cycles that once caused pain. The individual who learns, reflects, and grows becomes unshakable. They understand that their value is inherent, not assigned. They realize that their peace is priceless, not negotiable. And once this realization takes root, no rejection, betrayal, or misunderstanding can truly destroy them. Instead, every challenge becomes a lesson, every ending becomes a redirection, and every moment of clarity becomes a step toward a stronger, wiser, and more emotionally free life. Self-destruction rarely begins with loud chaos. It usually starts with quiet denial. When a person constantly avoids accountability, they slowly build a fragile identity that depends entirely on how others react to them. Instead of strengthening their inner character, they polish an outer image, hoping admiration will replace authenticity. But admiration without substance is like paint on cracked walls. It looks impressive from a distance, yet collapses under pressure. When someone pushes away the very people who once offered emotional understanding and patience, they unknowingly remove the mirrors that reflected their better potential. Without those mirrors, they stop seeing themselves clearly, and confusion replaces confidence. This inner confusion becomes the seed of self-destruction, because a person who does not know themselves begins to make decisions based on ego instead of wisdom, impulse instead of reflection, and pride instead of growth. Manipulation can only survive where participation exists. It is not a self-sustaining force. It feeds on reactions, emotions, and attention. The moment those reactions disappear, manipulation starves. This is why the withdrawal of a compassionate person feels so devastating to someone who relied on control. It is not merely the loss of a relationship. It is the loss of influence, validation, and emotional supply. When control no longer works, frustration rises. Frustration then transforms into anger, blame, or even self-pity. Instead of asking, "What can I learn?" the destructive mind asks, "Who can I blame?" This shift in questioning determines the direction of a person's life. Blame traps the mind in a cycle of repetition, while reflection opens the door to transformation. Without reflection, the same mistakes replay with different faces, and each repetition chips away at self-respect until the individual no longer recognizes the person they have become. Emotional dependency is another silent architect of downfall. When someone relies on others to feel worthy, they hand over control of their happiness. Every compliment becomes a temporary high, and every criticism becomes a deep wound. This imbalance creates emotional instability, where mood rises and falls based on external voices rather than internal assurance. When the empathetic individual finally steps back and removes their consistent reassurance, the dependent person feels abandoned, not because they were unloved, but because they never learned to love themselves independently. The absence of external affirmation exposes the emptiness within, and without inner strength, that emptiness begins to echo loudly. It is in this echo that destructive behaviors often emerge. Impulsive decisions, damaged relationships, and regretful actions that stem from desperation rather than clarity. Patterns are powerful forces. A person who refuses to break harmful patterns unknowingly becomes imprisoned by them. Each repeated behavior strengthens neural and emotional pathways, making change feel uncomfortable and familiarity feel safe, even when that familiarity is painful. The tragedy is not that people make mistakes. Mistakes are part of being human. The tragedy is defending those mistakes as if they are virtues. When harmful behavior is justified instead of corrected, growth becomes impossible. Over time, this resistance to change isolates the individual. Relationships weaken, trust erodes, and opportunities disappear, not because the world is unfair, but because unaddressed patterns quietly close doors that humility could have opened. Self-destruction is often nothing more than repeated refusal to evolve. Yet there is a powerful contrast that reveals hope the moment a person chooses awareness over denial. The entire trajectory of their life can shift. Awareness is uncomfortable because it requires honesty, and honesty exposes flaws. However, exposure is not humiliation, it is illumination. A flaw seen clearly is a flaw that can be improved. A weakness acknowledged becomes a starting point for strength. Those who rise are not those who never fall, but those who study their falls and adjust their steps. The difference between collapse and comeback is the willingness to confront inner truth without excuses. Emotional maturity grows when individuals learn to pause before reacting, to listen before accusing, and to evaluate before judging. These small disciplines accumulate into powerful transformation. Ultimately, the greatest power any individual possesses is the ability to choose growth over pride. Pride resists correction because it fears looking small, but growth understands that humility is not weakness. It is the gateway to expansion. When someone pushes away people who care deeply, they are given an unexpected gift disguised as loss, the opportunity to reflect on their behavior and rebuild their character. Whether they accept this gift determines their future. Self-destruction is not fate, it is a sequence of unexamined choices. Likewise, self-development is not luck. It is a sequence of intentional decisions. Every day presents a crossroads between repeating old habits and creating new standards. Those who choose introspection, accountability, and emotional discipline discover that true strength is not found in controlling others, but in mastering oneself. One of the most important truths to understand about emotionally destructive behavior is that it rarely comes from strength. It almost always grows from insecurity that has been ignored for too long. A person who constantly needs admiration, validation, and control is often trying to silence an inner voice that tells them they are not enough. Instead of developing self-worth through discipline, reflection, and personal growth, they attempt to build it through the reactions of others. This creates a fragile identity, one that looks powerful on the outside but is deeply unstable within. When their sense of importance depends on external approval, they unknowingly hand over control of their emotional stability to everyone around them. The danger in this pattern is that once the supply of admiration disappears, they are left with the very emptiness they tried to escape. On the other side of this dynamic stands the empathetic individual, a person whose natural instinct is to understand, forgive, and give chances. Empaths often endure more pain than they should because their compassion is genuine and their hope for change is strong. They believe people can grow, improve, and learn from mistakes. While this is a beautiful quality, it can also become a silent burden when not balanced with boundaries. The empath may continue offering patience long after respect has been lost, not because they are weak, but because they value emotional connection deeply. However, every human heart has limits. Compassion is powerful, but it is not meant to be endless tolerance of mistreatment. When empathy is not protected by self-respect, it slowly turns into emotional exhaustion. The moment an empath reaches their emotional edge is rarely loud or dramatic. It is usually quiet, calm, and final. When they withdraw, they do not always shout or seek revenge. Instead, they detach. This detachment is often misunderstood because it does not look like anger. Yet it is far more decisive than anger could ever be. Anger still carries emotion and involvement, but detachment is the absence of both. It is the closing of a door that has been knocked on too many times. Once an empath decides to protect their peace, they do so with clarity, not chaos. Their silence becomes a statement louder than arguments ever were. This is the turning point where the emotional balance shifts completely. For the individual who relied heavily on emotional control or manipulation, the loss of an empath can feel like losing oxygen without realizing they were holding their breath. Their sense of power was tied to the reactions they received. Without someone responding to their tactics, their strategies lose effectiveness. Manipulation requires participation. Control requires engagement. When the empath stops reacting, the manipulator is forced to confront a reality they spent years avoiding themselves. This confrontation is uncomfortable and often leads to inner conflict. Instead of recognizing the opportunity for growth, many resist it, which begins a cycle of frustration and self-sabotage. The beginning of self-destruction is not always visible from the outside. It often appears as pride, denial, or blame placed on others. Internally, however, it is a slow erosion of confidence and clarity. When someone refuses accountability, they trap themselves in repeating the same mistakes. Relationships continue to fail, trust continues to break, and confusion continues to grow. Rather than learning from consequences, they interpret them as injustices. This mindset blocks personal development because growth requires humility. Without humility, wisdom cannot enter, and without wisdom, patterns remain unchanged. Over time, this creates isolation, not because people abandon them without reason, but because their behavior pushes others away repeatedly. True power does not come from controlling others. It comes from mastering oneself. Emotional discipline, self-awareness, and healthy boundaries are far more effective than dominance or manipulation. A person who understands their emotions can respond instead of react. They can choose peace instead of conflict and reflection instead of denial. Boundaries are not acts of hostility. They are acts of self-protection. When someone establishes clear limits, they are not rejecting connection. They are defining the conditions under which connection can remain healthy. This clarity prevents resentment and preserves dignity on both sides. The greatest transformation occurs when individuals choose healing over revenge and wisdom over resentment. Healing is not forgetting what happened or pretending pain never existed. It is acknowledging the experience, learning from it, and deciding not to let it define the future. Revenge keeps people emotionally tied to the past, while healing releases them into growth. Wisdom allows a person to recognize patterns early, protect their energy, and invest in relationships that are mutual and respectful. When someone commits to personal growth, they break cycles that once controlled them. They begin to attract healthier interactions, not by force, but by alignment with their improved mindset. In the end, self-development is the only path that leads to lasting confidence, stable relationships, and genuine inner peace. Narcissistic behavior often appears as confidence, dominance, and certainty, yet beneath the surface it is frequently rooted in deep insecurity and fragile self-worth. What looks like strength is often a carefully constructed shield designed to hide fear of rejection, abandonment, or insignificance. When a person builds their identity on admiration from others instead of internal values, they become dependent on constant approval. This dependence creates emotional instability because external validation is unpredictable. The moment praise fades or criticism appears, the foundation begins to shake. True confidence grows from self-knowledge and accountability, but false confidence grows from comparison and control, and anything built on comparison eventually collapses under its own weight. Empaths, on the other hand, naturally extend patience, understanding, and compassion even when they are being hurt. Their ability to see the good in people becomes both their gift and their vulnerability. They often endure emotional discomfort longer than they should because they believe healing is possible for everyone. This endurance is not weakness, it is emotional generosity. However, generosity without limits can lead to exhaustion. When someone continuously gives without receiving respect or appreciation, their inner energy slowly drains. The empath's challenge is learning that compassion should not require self-sacrifice. Caring for others must never come at the cost of abandoning oneself. Every empath has a threshold, a point where tolerance turns into clarity. When that emotional edge is finally reached, the change is quiet but powerful. Instead of dramatic confrontation, there is often a calm withdrawal. This withdrawal is misunderstood by many because it lacks noise, but silence can be the loudest message. When an empath decides to detach, it usually means they have processed the pain, accepted reality, and chosen peace over conflict. This decision is rarely impulsive. It is the result of accumulated disappointment. Once this boundary is set, it becomes firm because it is built on self-respect rather than emotion. For individuals who depend heavily on emotional supply, admiration, or control, the loss of an empath can feel like losing a mirror that constantly reflected their desired image. They may not miss the person as much as they miss the validation and stability the person provided. This realization can trigger confusion and frustration because their usual methods of influence no longer work. When manipulation meets indifference, it loses its power. The absence of emotional reaction forces a confrontation with inner emptiness, something they often avoid. Without external reinforcement, unresolved insecurities become louder and harder to ignore. Self-destruction does not always appear as dramatic failure. It often begins internally through denial, blame, and refusal to reflect. When someone continuously avoids accountability, they repeat the same patterns in different relationships, workplaces, and environments. Instead of growth, they experience cycles of temporary success followed by sudden breakdowns. This pattern erodes trust and damages credibility over time. The true destruction lies in stagnation, the inability to evolve emotionally. A person who refuses to learn from consequences is not being strong. They are resisting the very process that leads to maturity and fulfillment. The greatest power any individual can possess is self-awareness. When someone understands their triggers, emotions, and behavioral patterns, they gain control over their reactions instead of being controlled by them. Boundaries are not barriers meant to push people away. They are guidelines that protect mental and emotional health. Emotional discipline allows a person to respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. This discipline transforms relationships, decision-making, and personal growth. Without it, life becomes a series of emotional impulses. With it, life becomes intentional and balanced. Growth begins the moment a person chooses healing instead of revenge. Revenge keeps the mind chained to the past, while healing opens the door to the future. Wisdom develops when experiences are analyzed, lessons are accepted, and responsibility is embraced. Resentment may feel powerful temporarily, but it drains energy and clouds judgment. Choosing peace is not surrender, it is strategic strength. It means understanding that inner stability is more valuable than external victory. When a person prioritizes emotional well-being over ego, they create space for healthier connections and clearer thinking. Ultimately, transformation is available to anyone willing to confront their inner truth. The difference between those who rise and those who fall is not intelligence, talent, or opportunity. It is the willingness to reflect and adjust. Pushing away those who genuinely care may create a temporary illusion of control, but it often leads to isolation and regret. In contrast, learning from mistakes builds resilience and depth of character. Personal evolution is not about perfection, it is about progress. When individuals choose self-reflection over denial and responsibility over blame, they break destructive cycles and step into a more stable, empowered version of themselves.